Welcome. I'm Spencer Overton. I'm a professor of law and the founder and faculty director of the Multiracial Democracy Project here at GW Law. We focus on solutions that facilitate our nation's transition to a well-functioning democracy that truly represents our increasingly diverse population. We serve as a bridge between academic, civil rights, democracy reform, technology, philanthropic, and policy communities. Right now, we've got two initiatives, one focusing on AI and the other on alternative election structures. We really appreciate you joining us today. Over the past few months, we've had great turnout and fascinating discussions. You can check out our past webinars on our Multiracial Democracy Project YouTube channel. Our goal with this webinar series is to create a space for thought leaders from philanthropy, the academy, and media to come together and consider how contemporary issues shape how we build a multiracial democracy. And before I introduce our guest for today, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. This will be our last webinar for a couple of months as our team will be taking a short break in July and August. We'll use this time to recharge, plan future content, and return with exciting topics and conversations in the fall. As a reminder about the format, we're going to record the entire session today, including the interactive conversation. But we don't want a chill discussion of sensitive items. And so if you'd like to ask a question but remain anonymous, just send me your question or comment directly in the comments box and indicate that you'd like to remain anonymous. I'll read your question or comment to the group without mentioning your name. Now, for today's conversation, let me first say thank you to our guests for joining today's webinar on voting behaviors in the Indigenous community. We're honored to have these two amazing presenters with us today for this conversation. Our first presenter, Gall, is the founder and principal of Blockwell Consulting, which she launched in 2021 following more than 15 years of work in nonprofit organizations advancing civil rights in the United States. Dr. Gall is widely recognized as a subject matter expert in census, demographic data, and Voting Rights Act compliance. Her professional and research history spans a wide range of critical policy areas, including voting rights, redistricting, historical narratives, demographic trends, and many other civil rights-based public policy issues and legal analyses. We're also grateful to be joined by Jacqueline De León, who's a senior staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, which is also known as NARF. Ms. De León is an enrolled member of the Isleta Pueblo, a tribe, and is a nationally recognized expert on Native American voting rights, just a top star here. At NARF, she leads the Voting Rights Practice Group, where she spearheads national litigation, policy advocacy, and research aimed at advancing Native American voting rights and civic engagement. Her expertise has led her to testify before Congress multiple times on the challenges Native communities face in accessing the ballot. She also serves as chair of the advisory committee of the American Bar Association's Bipartisan Standing Committee on Election Law. So to begin today's presentations, Megan will share some of her findings from data on voting trends in the Indigenous community in recent U.S. elections. Following her, we'll pass it over to Jacqueline to speak about the systemic obstacles and barriers impacting communities and just to have Jacqueline provide context to the numbers. So thank you so much for being here today. And without further ado, Dr. Gall, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Spencer, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today talking about the barriers to voting in Indian country. Hold on, there we go. We're going to talk quickly about the types of barriers to voting, Then we'll spend a good bit of time looking at some data and research around these barriers. And finally, we'll look at some data and research showing the impact of these barriers. There are more structural and systemic barriers to voting for Native Americans than any other racial or ethnic group. Not all are represented here, but I mostly deal with these four, which include geography, which revolves around things like geographic isolation, natural boundaries, and poor road networks. Mail issues like lack of residential addressing and mail delivery, which impact nearly every point in the registration and voting process. Demographic characteristics like access to internet and socioeconomic conditions, and history of prolonged and significant discrimination and oppression. And you can read more in depth about these issues in NARF's Obstacles at Every Turn report. And we're going to explore some of these issues through data now. First, I want to explore turnout overall. We look at turnout to understand Native participation and the impacts of the obstacles mentioned before. This is from research my company did with NARF, which you can find in the Election Inequalities in Indian Country report. Nationwide, the average Native turnout is 37%, which is more than 20% lower than non-Hispanic white voters. The gap grows to over 25% in states with large Native American populations, which you can see in green on the map. In fact, Native voters have the lowest turnout among the major racial and ethnic groups, and this gap has been growing since 2012, which as far as these particular data would allow us to look. One of those major obstacles that I mentioned is related to mail delivery. Again, with NARF, we did some research to quantify this gap in a report called Disconnected Democracy. This report explores the relationship between Native American populations and the availability of home delivery. We looked at type of enumeration areas, or TEAs, which is a geography from the Census Bureau. They use it to help in their decennial census planning. Every inch of the country is assigned to a TEA, and there are 4 categories, 2 of which are of main interest. The first is self-response, which means mail delivery is good, and the census can count on those self-responses from those households, which means they can mail a survey or email a survey and assume a self-response. That accounts for 95.45% of all households in the nation. Update leave means that mail delivery is not reliable and the census must make contact in other ways in order to get these surveys filled out. Update leave households account for only 4.52% of housing units. For this study, we also looked at the percent Native voting age population, demographic factors like education, income, and poverty, urbanity, which we defined as areas with more than 50,000 people, and whether or not the area was on or off reservation. And what we found was a nearly 1-to-1 relationship between Native American populations and housing units classified as update leave. That kind of finding is nearly unheard of in the social sciences. So a tract with 50% Native Americans had nearly 50% of those households marked as updated leave. Results held even when accounting for all those other factors I mentioned in the previous slide. And results also vary at the state level. I'm going to use some wonky language for the wonks in the room, but I'll also tell you the bottom line. We use regression models to explore these state level variations. This table shows the results for the percent Native American coefficient in 13 states with the significant Native American populations. The higher the number, the stronger the relationship. The first column shows the coefficient for the full model where we do control for reservations. And the second column shows a model where we do not control for reservations. The differences in the models indicate that in some states, reservations are strongly related to update leave and absorb some of that relationship between Native populations and the update leave status. In other words, the problem is more relevant for Natives on reservation as opposed to off reservation, but it's still clear that this is an issue for Natives everywhere. Overall, the results show that update leave is more strongly associated with Native populations in states like Nevada and California as compared to other states like Oklahoma and Wisconsin. We also did a case study to support these findings. We compared the number of households on reservation according to the 2020 decennial census to the U.S. Department of Transportation standard addresses list. The map here shows reservations in Arizona, which have only 1.9% of all Arizona households. And what we found is that residents off reservation in Arizona are 105 times more likely to have a standard address than residents on reservation. In hard numbers, that means that more than 40,000 households on reservation in Arizona alone face additional hurdles due to mail issues. For context, the Arizona margin of victory was 10,457 votes in the 2020 presidential election and less than 300 votes in the state attorney general contest, indicating clear electoral impact is plausible. Now, I'm not going to read this whole slide, but the point of the slide is to demonstrate the massive trickle-down impacts these mailing issues have on voting. There are complications to registering, voting in person or by mail, and navigating the election system that may cause Native voters to have registrations rejected, or may lead to undertrained election staff asking Native voters to vote provisionally, or be placed in the wrong voting precincts. Vote by mail ballots may not get delivered in a timely fashion or at all, and on and on. Before we move into exploring the impacts of these barriers, aside from the turnout differences we already looked at, let's look at some of the other critical factors like broadband access and poverty. In states with the largest Native populations, there are nearly 800,000 households on reservation with no broadband access. And again, that can impact, among other things, registration, vote by mail, and responding to election administrations around things like removal from the voter rolls. This map shows Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. When we map reservations and broadband access, with the deep red areas having the lowest rates of broadband, we can see the relationship. Now take a look at differences in poverty. The chart on the left shows percentage poverty in states with the largest Native American populations. Poverty rates for all people are in the yellow triangles, and rates for Native Americans are the green circles. And the gap is clear to the eye. In the table, we tally the number and percentage of Native Americans living in poverty. That's nearly 50% in South Dakota, 35% in Montana, and 19% in Oklahoma. And in this map, again, we outline the reservations and mapped poverty. And the correlation between the two is stark to the eye, where the deepest poverty is clearly and almost exclusively defined to reservations. And we can fill out this picture by looking at factors like educational attainment, number of cars available in the household, employment, and many, many other demographic factors. We compiled a huge number of indicators for the NCAI, the National Conference of American Indians, and you can explore more in those regional profiles because they paint a really vivid picture of the demographics at play. Finally, we can also look at numbers of people covered by Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 203 comes into play if more than 5% of voting age citizens are members of a single language minority group and have limited English proficiency, or there are more than 10,000 speakers of that language and the illiteracy rate of that group is above the national average. In that case, jurisdictions are required to provide bilingual voting materials and assistance at the polls. The first table shows the number of jurisdictions covered for native languages, and the second table tallies the number of native speakers covered. As of the last determination, and in states with the large Native American populations, nearly 325,000 natives out of nearly 850,000 were covered. This leaves an enormous gap of about 522,000 native voters. Now, not all of these voters need language services, but when we're trying to understand the barriers, language differences is a big one. And you've heard me use the word may over and over and over. This is because we know these barriers impact Native voter participation, but direct causation can be hard to quantitatively prove. But we did do some research around with using EAC Eves data to try to fill this gap. The Election Administration and Voting Survey is conducted by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission after every federal election. It's voluntary for election administrators to fill out, which leads to some data issues, but they are asked a whole host of very useful questions that are not holistically documented anywhere else. Due to the nature of these data, we had to break counties into groups, including counties on reservation, counties not on reservation, and homogeneously white counties, which means counties with a population of 90% or more white voting age population. Then we took these categories from the Eves data and asked whether the groups of counties varied to a statistically significant degree, which is noted by the asterisks. In every category, the differences were significant, including the percentage of registered voting age population, percentage turnout, percentage rejected registrations, percentage of voters removed from the rolls, percentage of mail ballots rejected, and percentage of provisional votes and rejection of provisional votes. Every single category was significant, every single one. We found that 3 times as many provisional ballots were cast in reservation counties compared to non-reservation counties. Again, in hard numbers, in the 155 reservation counties, almost 23,000 provisional ballots were used, as compared to only 6,000 in the 387 non-reservation counties. Profound difference. The average rate of provisional ballot rejection is 43% in reservation counties, which is more than 4 times as high as homogeneous white counties and double the rate of non-reservation counties. And we can drill down to reasons for provisional ballot and mail ballot rejections. Here we're looking at mail ballot rejections in Arizona. More than 50% were due to signature issues. Another 30% were due to deadline issues, which, as we've explored, may easily be due to addressing issues in Indian country. And we can drill down even further on signature issues. About 60% of signature issues were due to non-matching signatures, and another 40% was because the voter didn't sign appropriately. But these issues are more complex for Native voters. For example, my friend has the last name Birdsong, and she gave me permission to use her as an example. This is how she writes her last name. And so, she is more likely to have a signature mismatch or have her signature deemed a did not sign ballot. So we know these barriers have real impacts. We can see it in the data, and we're working on updating our EAC Eves analysis when the 2024 data drops soon. So we're anxious to see how those new numbers unfold the story further. We went through what the barriers are and how they impact Native voters, and I haven't even touched on everything. For example, rural counties sometimes use only one voting location, which is typically at the county seat or admin buildings. We run something we call a distance analysis that calculates the average time and distance to voting locations for Native voters and non-Native voters. And the differences are sometimes stark. And we do this to show how geographic isolation, poor road networks, and natural barriers further burden Native voters. You can see how these barriers stack against Native voters to suppress access and drive down participation. And we are working hard to paint a fulsome picture of the issues, but we're hampered by things like data availability and data granularity. But even within the work we can do, we see the very, very real impact. Thanks for coming and for listening, and to you good folks for hosting this series so that we can talk about and explore these really critical issues with all of you.
Thanks so much, Megan. It has been, we really appreciate that fulsome overview so much. And I think I'm going to jump into my presentation now. Thanks so much to Spencer and to GW for having us. It's an important conversation, and we sincerely appreciate the opportunity to share with you all really, I think, some pressing issues in Indian country. And so I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see here. Okay. So Megan did a good job of talking a little bit about the structural overviews, and I think, unfortunately, a bit of a bleak picture, right? That shows that there is depressed turnout among Native American communities. And just sort of taking us to the beginning, I think it's important to acknowledge that Native Americans have a unique journey towards citizenship in this country. For many years, Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States, and of course continue to this day to be citizens of their own nations. But just about over 100 years ago, in 1924, Congress unilaterally conferred citizenship upon Native Americans. But that did not mean that they were entitled to vote. And in fact, Native Americans have long struggled for the right to vote. Let's see here. You know, I think it might make sense, Joseph, if you can go ahead and show my slides, given my connectivity issues. Does that work? In the meantime, you can keep trying to go. There we go. Apologies. And so if you go to the next slide, and so Native Americans, you know, didn't have suffrage conferred even when they were granted citizenship. Instead, Native Americans have had a long struggle, mirroring many other civil rights movements towards citizenship. And so beginning in the 1920s, citizenship was conferred, and then states, I think, immediately saw the potential impact of Native American electorate, and so had explicit provisions preventing Native Americans from voting. These included constitutional provisions that said that Native Americans could not vote, and they also included provisions that were explicit that said that Native Americans had to give up their rights of Native American participation and citizenship in order to participate in state elections. So things like really awful provisions like, have to give up savagery in order to be entitled to vote. As a consequence, there's a deep-rooted feeling among Native American communities that voting can be non-Native or has consequences to Native citizenship. And it wasn't until the slide before, if you could, it wasn't until from 1948 all the way through 1962, states were litigating to try and keep Native Americans from being able to vote. And it wasn't until 1962 that the final state, Utah, was able to allowed Native Americans to vote. And so Native Americans have a long history of being completely disenfranchised. Of course, immediately upon allowing Native Americans to vote, they nevertheless started implementing structural barriers and explicit barriers to keep Native Americans from voting. So Alaska, for example, had a literacy requirement, which ads at the time explicitly said were intended to keep Native Americans from being able to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act had a intense effect upon Native Americans. And we saw litigation mirroring that of other civil rights movements aimed at increasing Native American voting access. And the literacy provision, the language minority provisions of 1975 also had a profound effect on Indian country, because we saw, again, literacy tests and provisions keeping Native Americans from being able to vote. So from the 70s all the way till about 2013, we saw the Voting Rights Act play an incredibly important role at keeping voter discrimination at bay. Unfortunately, in 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County v. Holder gutted Section 5, and in that instance, Arizona and Alaska no longer fell under Section 5 provisions, and immediately we saw an implementation in Arizona of a ban on ballot collection, which, of course, was hugely consequential in Native American communities. As Megan was discussing, there are structural barriers that keep Native Americans from being able to vote, including poor roads, lack of residential mail delivery, which make ballot collection incredibly important on Native reservations. But then in 2021, we saw Section 2 hobbled in Brnovich over those very ballot collection barriers. And we saw an increased hostility towards the Voting Rights Act. And then finally, we'll see in a case out of Turtle Mountain, which I'll discuss in a moment, real issues with the court hobbling the Voting Rights Act further. And so among Native American communities, there's this long history of voter suppression and outright vote denial. And so often we're talking to Native communities about why it's important to even engage at all. We talk about the need to protect sovereignty, spread community values, access resources, improve those infrastructure failures, approve projects, secure zoning and permits, and have responsive representatives that actually understand what is happening in Native communities. So much of why Native reservations lag so significantly behind is because of the lack of political capital and the lack of the ability to actually affect elections. Next slide. And so at NARF, we undertook the project to sort of question, why is it so difficult to vote in Indian country? And as Megan mentioned, we conducted a series of field hearings across Indian country with the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, asking why is it so difficult to vote, and subsequently released a nearly 200-page report based on 9 field hearings across Indian country. And what we saw was a remarkably consistent picture, which is really surprising given sort of the depth and breadth of different Native communities across the country. And so, again, we saw these really structural issues, so long distances, having to go to different registration offices and voting locations, the lack of transportation and infrastructure, including poor roads, impassable in wintry months of November, poor internet, the lack of traditional mailing addresses, disproportionately high rates of poverty and homelessness, which really make all of these issues compounded, language discrimination. And then I think we want to make clear there is continued racism in border towns from voting officials impacting the Native Americans' right to vote. And sometimes this is explicit and sometimes it is less than explicit. For example, when I was negotiating with different counties in Montana over opening in-person voter registration, or excuse me, voter opportunities during COVID, county officials were willing to keep in-person access in their 90% white towns. I was told explicitly that they didn't want to catch COVID from the reservation and they weren't willing to open in-person access for the Native American reservations. Now, if you're willing to give services and take risks for one population and not the other, really, I think that gets to the core of the type of othering that we're seeing across Indian country. And, it can be even more explicit than that. In Utah, an election official backdated and falsified a complaint against a Native candidate to keep them from running, and eventually that was exposed, but no charges were brought against that election official. And so Native Americans intuitively know that the system has been rigged against them, and there is a belief among some Native Americans that they are not part of the American democratic system, which leads to increased disenfranchisement. But I think really at the core, what we're seeing is it's not just an anger. Really what it is the systemic mistreatment. And then we get an explanation that, no, that's just apathy. It's not. If it's really literally difficult to vote, we're going to see a lot of people fall off. Next slide. And I think, this kind of paints the picture for everyone. So it says my reservation is divided into 2 counties. Each county seat is an hour away. One way, that's something like 55 miles each way to actually get to a poll. No one's willing to do that because they don't have the resources, the vehicle, the home mailing address, and gas money. Unemployment is high here. For transportation, you need money for a car, you need a driver's license, and a lot of people don't get them because it costs money to get a license, and you have to drive to the courthouse to get it. So really, I think this speaks to the deep barriers that Native voters are facing and the acute feeling that the system is not built for them. Next slide. And so what we're also seeing, I think, across Indian country and across America is a manipulation of the voting rules in a way that's meant to look neutral, right? So having these laws of neutral applicability, but in fact, they are manipulated to cut Native voters out. And so, for example, we see, again, these bans on ballot collection. We saw them in Montana directly after Native Americans flexed their political power. We see a ban on ballot collection when Native communities especially depend upon the ability of other folks to pool resources and pick up and drop off ballots. We see an intentional keeping of resources from Native reservations, a lack of on-reservation polling sites, attempting to move to all vote by mail systems for Native communities when Native communities do not have residential mail delivery, and other sort of structural roadmap blocks that make it especially difficult for Native communities to vote and target the types of tools that Native communities use in order to overcome these sort of structural barriers that plague their communities. And so what we're seeing is this battle for access and states manipulating voter rules to cut Native voters out. Next slide. And so I think it helps to sort of see how this plays out. And North Dakota in particular is a helpful study. So in 2012, Heidi Heitkamp won the U.S. Senate race in North Dakota. And this was incredibly surprising. North Dakota is a very red state, and Native Americans were attributed with her win. She won by about 2,500 votes, so very slim margins. And the very next legislative session in 2013, even though the state legislature had been debating and rejected a voter ID bill in the previous legislative session, they again picked up this voter ID provision, but this time they added a requirement that the IDs have a residential address on them. Now, as Megan was saying, across Indian country, many homes lack residential addresses. As a result, Native Americans ended up being widely disenfranchised, not only because they didn't have the IDs, the types of IDs that North Dakota allowed, but also because of this residential address requirement. Of course, a voter required to show something that they don't have through no fault of their own, which is not sort of necessary for actual, proof of citizenship or age, which are requirements to vote, is a literacy test. It's a modern day literacy test. And so we saw the disenfranchisement of Native people, and NARF joined with tribal plaintiffs to sue, and we won in district court in North Dakota before conservative judges because of sort of the blatant discrimination. And what does North Dakota do? The very next legislative session, they pass a functionally same law, again, still keeping the address requirement. So we have to sue again. And at this point, Native Americans, there's an election coming up very quickly. It's Heidi Heitkamp's re-election at this point. And the courts stay relief. We win. The courts ends up staying relief through the election, but then we get a consent decree after, and Heidi, of course, loses again. And so what we see is this manipulation of the court system and a manipulation of the legislative rules in order to really rig outcomes against Native Americans and penalizing them for flexing their political power. Next slide. And we see this across the country. We see Native Americans flex their political power, and we see an immediate backlash. So in Montana, I mentioned that we had been doing litigation against ballot collection. Well, that litigation started about 8 years ago. Following our win in the Montana Supreme Court, finding under Montana's right to vote provision that Native Americans needed ballot collection, the very next legislative session, they again passed another ballot collection ban, and they also banned election day registration. We again went to the Supreme Court of Montana, which found that Native Americans needed these services given the lack of access in their communities. And then this legislative session, they have again they've dropped the ballot collection issue finally, but now they've cut out 8 hours of registration on election day, despite a previous court finding that Native Americans needed election day registration, often because they show up and they, through no fault of their own, and again, these addressing issues, they find that their registration isn't fully correct. And so they have to make corrections to those errors. And so we will be suing them again. This will be the third time in Montana. And again, in Arizona, we see we had lawsuits around the voter rules there. And this is, of course, as Megan mentioned, in a state where statewide elections are decided by as few as under 300 votes. So the margins are incredibly slim, and Native Americans are many, many votes left on the table. And we could go to the next slide. And so, across Indian country, we're seeing vote denial litigation because of these rules that are penalizing Native Americans for flexing their political power. This last redistricting cycle, we also saw a discrimination across Indian country. We see the continued usage of at-large election schemes, which are meant to disenfranchise Native communities. So what we see is, for example, they hold an election completely at large, even though there's a 40 or 30% Native population, refuse to draw districts where Natives are entitled to 1-2 of the seats out of the five-member county commission or the like. And so actually we have been successful in all of these cases here, but are facing a particular roadblock, next slide, in North Dakota. So the courts have continually been stripping power from Native American communities and from all Native communities, diluting the Voting Rights Act. And in Turtle Mountain v. Howe, which was a redistricting challenge to the state legislative plan, we won in front of a Trump-appointed judge a voting rights violation for their map. Native Americans were entitled to 3 seats when in a combination districts, as opposed to just the one that the legislature had provided for them. And the state, rather than really dispute, or at least in a fulsome way, dispute the fact that a voting rights violation existed, are instead challenging the very ability for plaintiffs to bring suits at all. And so what they have said is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act does not contain a cause of action for any private plaintiffs. And in a different case out of the Eighth Circuit said that that all plaintiffs didn't have a cause of action under Section 2. In Turtle Mountain, we also had an additional cause of action under Section 1983, finding that we had saying that we had an ability to bring cases under that seminal civil rights statute. And recently, we had a devastating opinion from the Eighth Circuit finding that no private plaintiffs also do not have a cause of action under 1983, which means that in the Eighth Circuit right now, 7 states, plaintiffs cannot bring suit under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to allege discrimination. Instead, must depend on the Department of Justice to bring cases when the Department of Justice has recently been gutted from over 30 attorneys to 2 attorneys. And out of over 180 successful cases brought solely by private plaintiffs, that were successful under the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice only has brought 15 of those. So it's been private plaintiffs that have been really been enforcing the Voting Rights Act all along. And of course, this is a devastating opinion. We are seeking en banc review from the Eighth Circuit and are in close coordination with civil rights communities to talk more about this devastating decision and how we're going to combat it. Next slide. And so we are not laying down. We are not sort of going to accept that this is the reality. NARF works night and day to ensure increased Native turnout across the country. We have an intense election day monitoring program, and we uncover startling things like in Montana, there was a police officer that was seated at the registration table directing people to vote for Donald Trump. We also issue voter guides. We demand language access. And we push for the Native American Voting Rights Act, which is the next slide. And so often what I hear is, why don't you just open a polling place on the reservation? Yes, and we have been pushing counties to do that. We often have roadblocks, excuses. And so the Native American Voting Rights Act would mandate on-reservation equitable access across Native communities. And we think it's a common sense solution to many of these structural barriers. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss voting barriers, and happy to take any questions.
Sounds good. So we're going to just kind of open it up now in terms of questions. Just raise your hand here, and then we've got some anonymous questions. So let me start off with one anonymous question here. And that question is, I know NARF has had great success with litigation to expand access to the ballot. We appreciate all their work. What other efforts have been successful organizing civic engagement and education, state policies? So just tee that up.
Yeah, so again, this has to be a multi-front fight, and we certainly think that Native American Voting Rights Acts, state Native American Voting Rights Acts are essential to this fight. We've seen passage of those Voting Rights Act in places like New Mexico and Washington State, and they can provide critical increases in access across Indian country. We face an uphill battle in some of those. Native Americans are often minorities in places that have pretty hostile state legislatures as well. But I think that through advocacy and community engagement, we can start seeing some passage. And I think also sort of at an everyday level, people, especially in states that where there is not increased access, calls to county officials demanding equitable access for Native Americans, which is often at the discretion of those local officials, can be really key to increasing Native American access.
So let me tee this question up for both of you here. And, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. So what are some key missteps or misconceptions that some within philanthropy or the media have with regard to challenges Native communities face in democratic participation? And what are some key steps philanthropy and the media can take to help address some of these challenges?
I'm happy to speak a little bit about that, and then Megan can maybe also jump in. So I think that the biggest misconception that we see in the media is that Native American voters are just apathetic, right? There is, of course, a complicated history with the unilateral conferral of citizenship and the access to various, and sort of Native participation. But that does not mean that Native voters are just apathetic. What they are dealing with is a system that is designed to keep them out, a system that is communicating to them every single day that they are not part of the system or wanted. And so overcoming that and those systemic barriers is something that I think should be reported on as obstacles as opposed to just apathy, right? And then I think that a mistake that philanthropy and that the media make is that the Native vote is less than consequential. But Native voters are poised across the country to make the decisions really that affect this country. So Native Americans make up a larger, eligible Native voters make up a larger population than the difference in vote margins in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Arizona, New Mexico, really key states, right, that have a lot of electoral power in our current system. And if Native Americans were fully enfranchised, if they were actually engaged, if their structural issues were overcome, then I think that we could have really different outcomes in our electoral system. And leaving those votes on the table, philanthropy, there's some really stark numbers on how much Native Americans are left out of that ecosystem. And so I think, it's important that Native Americans and Native American organizations are engaged a more fulsome way.
So what I would add to that, it revolves a lot around data. A lot of the data sets that we use for Voting Rights Act litigation, for policy assessment and program assessment, has really good numbers and data for the major racial and ethnic groups, like really stable numbers for white, African American, Latino. But when you get down to the smaller numbers of Native American populations, some of those data, they just don't even report Native numbers. Or if they do report Native numbers, the errors on those, the margins of errors are enormous that make it very difficult to use. And so investment in getting solid data sources that allow us to do the research we need to do to influence policy would be exceptionally helpful. I would say one of the missteps that we can sometimes see in the media is around election polls, or I'm sorry, exit polls around elections. Exit polls have a lot of issues, including response bias, polling site choices, where they're choosing to conduct these exit polls, risks of misinterpretation of those results. And we see media outlets put out sweeping statements about Native voting behavior, both based on those exit polls. And that can lead to erroneous assumptions and erroneous narratives that don't match the truth on the ground.
Appreciate that. Please, anybody, if you raise your hand, I do have another question here, which is that we see these kind of broadband mail election administration disparities. They're significant, seem to disproportionately deny voting opportunities in places like Arizona. One would think that the Voting Rights Act could provide a remedy, but, as Jacqueline talked about, Brnovich construed Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, so it could not or is hampered in terms of dealing with this. And we see the Eighth Circuit interpreting Section 2 to not include a private right of action. So if the policy environment was right, would you, kind of update the Voting Rights Act to deal with this? And is there another solution other than the Voting Rights Act? I think a related question to that is, does the special status of tribes that differs from other communities of color shape what can be done with regard to the Voting Rights Act update in terms of tribal populations here? So for example, before this conversation, I never thought about, well, is the Shelby County analysis, does it really work exactly with tribal communities here in light of their special status here? Should preclearance apply to tribal communities? And I don't know, I haven't thought about it, but this kind of stimulated that. So is there something about that special status that where you'd want to do something differently with regard to tribes in terms of protecting voting rights? So two parts in terms of how do you update, and then is there anything special about tribes in terms of constitutional status to update the voting rights or provide legislation?
So first, the Voting Rights Act is in dire need of updating, right? We're obviously seeing that there is attacks on the Voting Rights Act itself. As you say, through the Eighth Circuit, there should be a private right of action made explicit, just to, even though it's certainly been used for 50 years and there's precedent for that cause of action. We also saw Native communities particularly impacted by Brnovich and this so-called de minimis exception, the idea that communities can be so small that they don't need Voting Rights Act protections. And, we would want to explicitly get rid of that exception, because what we see in Native communities is, even if it's only a small percentage of the total Native population that's impacted, that can be a wholesale community, an entire reservation community that is left off of or that is cut off due to some voter rule. So we want to see that de minimis exception addressed in the Voting Rights Act. But besides sort of, beefing up of the Voting Rights Act, the question, I think, gets to sort of this unfamiliarity with Native communities writ large. And Native communities are entitled to full Voting Rights Act protections. Native Americans are still United States citizens, and they can bring Voting Rights Act claims, and things like Shelby County, if it applies to Arizona, right? Section 5, if it applied to Arizona, it would apply also to Native American communities, and so including on reservation. And so the special status of Native Americans is one where we have a duality in terms of the different classifications of rights that we're asserting, right? So there is political status that Native Americans have, right? We are citizens of both our tribal nations and the United States, and so there are times when that political classification is very important. There are times also where we suffer from racial discrimination, right? Based on the color of our skin and the discrimination that's deep rooted in many of these communities, like border towns. When it is our racial identity that is being discriminated against, we still have access to these civil rights protections, whether that be under the Voting Rights Act or other civil rights statutes, right? Racial discrimination is racial discrimination, and we see that happening across. That's why we utilize the Voting Rights Act to sue for redistricting violations, even if they occur on Native American land. And so really it's contextual what rights we're asserting at the time, but Native Americans are fully entitled to the protections of laws as United States citizens.
So I think my team wants me to wrap things up, but we got to just, Karen, you see had one question here, or I think that there's one question in the chat, I guess, here that maybe you want to respond to here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see it. What is?
So since tribes are government entities, explain that, how C3 or C4 organizations work with them. Are there examples of foundations directly supporting tribal governments?
Yeah, so thanks, Karen. So philanthropy can engage directly with Native American communities if they so choose. But there are C3 and C4 organizations that support Native communities. So there are national organizations such as the Native American Rights Fund, which is a nonprofit law firm, and a C3. And then there are other national organizations such as the National Congress of American Indians, Advanced Political Leadership, Native Organizers Alliance, again, national organizations that have C3 arms that are aimed at servicing Native American tribes in the voting space. And then there are local organizations, Western Native Voice, North Dakota Native Vote, that are aimed at servicing and getting out the vote at a local community level. And many of these organizations are part of what is called the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, which NARF leads in order to speak with and try and understand these issues in a unified way.
And can't you give to Native Americans in philanthropy as an intermediary to give to tribes? I think that's a question. Okay, got it.
Sure.
Okay, great. So now, as I wrap this up, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Megan and Jacqueline for sharing their insights and experience with us today. I also want to thank our executive director, Lisa Bornstein, for her leadership in organizing this event, and to Joseph Ricard for organizing all the details. So we hope you all have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the fall. Thank you so much.